Hi there, and welcome to Lecture 3 of Unit 6, Progressivism. Today our topic is going to be the women's suffrage movement and also the women's rights movement as it pertained to the era in progressivism. Between 1890 and 1920, many historians call that the women's era because they were on the heels of industrialization. There were many more economic and political opportunities available to women. 5 million women were working for wages. And through this, they became more independent. And as a result, there was once more a major push for women to earn more rights, and especially the right that they've been fighting for all the way back to 1848 in the Seneca Falls Convention, was the right to vote. So, to begin with, there was the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and this was made up of middle and upper class women that were very similar to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some of the original women that started this push for women's rights way back in the mid 1800s. Carrie Chapman Catt, the women all along had been involved in many reform movements, but they were often sidetracked with other reform movements, and they didn't. Some of the arguments that they used were against immigrants and so forth, and they were very conservative in their attempts to gain the right to vote. They didn't want to ruffle any feathers, and so they continued on, but they weren't, having much success. And again, the majority of men were opposed to the women's right to vote. It says here, danger, women's suffrage would double the irresponsible vote. It is a menace to the home, men's employment, and business. Men were worried that, with this these new economic and educational opportunities, women were becoming independent, and that frightened men, I believe. And they didn't want women to get out of the house and experience, all these new things that might be available to them. And so they wanted to keep women where they, could be controlled probably. Here you see headquarters opposed to women's suffrage. Now, Alice Paul began a new organization called the Congressional Union, and she was a college graduate and much younger than some of the other women that had been seeking the right to vote and other rights for women. And so her and other newly educated women began this new union, new organization, and they were quite different. They used aggressive protest, militant protests. Alice Paul, she and some of the other women chained themselves to the White House fence. For this, they were arrested. They had a seven-month prison sentence for that. And while they were in prison, she and some of the others went on a hunger strike, and they were force-fed. And all of this brought a major amount of attention to what they were seeking. And at the same time, World War I was going on, and people were starting to realize how seemingly ridiculous it was that women were not allowed to vote constitutionally. So I mentioned just a minute ago the impact of World War I. Women really stepped up while World War I was going on. Many men were off fighting in Europe, Americans, and some women actually went over to Europe and helped in the war effort. But while the men were gone, women stepped up and did the job. Many worked in factories. They took the responsibilities of the men while the men were gone and had no problem with it. And this just further proved that women were, as capable as men, and there's no justifiable reason not to allow them to vote. I just want to mention that many Western states, it was a state issue on whether women could vote or not, and many Western states provided women with the right to vote prior to the 19th Amendment being passed in 1920. Montana, for example, I believe was in 1916 or 1917. Wyoming, I believe, was the first in the 1890s. So that when the 19th Amendment was passed, it stated that basically states could not deny any person the right to vote based on their gender. So it was a long time coming. It was finally passed in 1920, and women were allowed the right to vote.
This is gonna be the best day of my life.
Here you can see in this cartoon, the gentleman here is having the children. They look like they're not all that happy. It's voting day, election day. Wife's going off to vote. He looks like he's panicking. I'm sure that was the thought of many men when the 19th Amendment was passed. Now, women were also fighting for a variety of other rights during this time. In 1908, there was a victory for women to some extent. The Supreme Court ruled that women could only work 10 hours a day. Ironically, in this case, that lawyers argued that women were not as physically fit as men and they could not, work as long as men. If that were to be argued today, I think women would have a problem with that argument. Like I mentioned before, women began attending college by 1920. Nearly half of all college enrollment were women. And again, this just provided more opportunities for them. Alice Paul and her organization, after the 19th Amendment was passed, they wanted an equal rights amendment. They wanted this amendment passed that provided women with equal opportunities. And that would continue on all the way really until the 1970s when it was eventually defeated. Also at this same time, Margaret Sanger came to the forefront. She advocated providing birth control to women, and this movement really unified women from all classes because this was very controversial. Margaret Sanger was imprisoned for opening up a clinic in New York that provided free contraceptives to poor immigrant women. And basically, the idea of birth control in the women's movement was that they wanted it to be provided so women weren't having children early on. If they were, that kind of dictated the life, set them on a certain path, and it cut down many of the opportunities that they would have. And finally, in today's lecture, I just want to briefly go over the legacy of progressivism. Like I said before, it was one of the most successful reform movements in the history of the United States. So some of the things that came from it: regulation, not laissez-faire. Ever since the progressive movement, the government has been involved in regulating businesses to some extent. Federal government now looks out for the less fortunate through a variety of programs: food stamps, welfare, unemployment, and has really ever since.
Everything's all wrong, yeah. Everything's all wrong, yeah. And stranger than your sympathy, I take these things so I don't feel, and all these thoughts from.
One of the goals of the progressives was to cut the income gap between the rich and the poor, and they did that to some extent through the creation of the graduated income tax. Eventually, the progressive ideals were mostly adopted by the Democratic Party, and you can see some of their beliefs are still very evident in the Democratic Party today. Obviously, women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment was a significant accomplishment of progressivism. And progressivism and the idea of Social Security and welfare and a lot of these, the government acting as to stimulate the economy, a lot of these a lot of their ideals set in motion. They were the stepping stone for the New Deal, which would be President Franklin Roosevelt's plan to bring the United States out of the Great Depression. So that's it for the first part of Unit 3, Progressivism.